I knew it, that is, but only in my head, so I didn't believe it. It's only when knowledge about something slowly spreads to the whole body that you truly know. I know too that I, like every living thing, will have to die someday, but my hands, my feet, and my guts still don't know it, which is why death seems so unreal. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today, I get to talk about The Wall by Marlen Haushofer, out from New Directions in a paperback, translated by Shaun Whiteside. To be honest with you right off the bat, I hope that you've watched my video on The Birds by Tarje Vesos because the sort of tone or mood of that experience is similar to the experience that I've had with reading The Wall. That is to say, that I don't think I've had such an emotionally moving and impactful experience with literature since reading The Birds. Honestly, The Wall is complex and profound, beautiful, severe, touching, heart-rending, gut-wrenching, and basically all the other compound adjectives that get applied to works of art that you really need to read in order to feel acutely alive. I guess to extend that thought a little bit, this is a book that you read to feel closer to the marrow of life, but you realize that you have to go through a sort of purging of your soul to get there. Yeah, you have to be willing to be thoroughly purged to face this book and to experience its profound and sort of inexplicable charms, pleasures, unspoken truths. Sometimes, you read a book to have your emotions stirred. But other times, as with this book, you read to have your heart squeezed with an iron grip until all of your emotions become choked in your throat. I think it's a challenging book. It's short, it's very immediate, but it's a challenging book in that you have to shed yourself of all of your predispositions at the start and be completely open to it. It has this sort of pleasurable agony and grating that's a lot like tonguing at a sore tooth. I will say this, just on a practical level, if you do decide to read the book, I would commit to reading the first 50 pages in one sitting. So, however long it takes you to read 50 pages, for me, that's about 2 hours. You need to make sure you block off 2 hours to read the first 50 pages. I feel like that's the point at which you become fully invested in this particular text. And still at a mere 200 pages, so then after that, you've read a fourth of it, you've got three-fourths to go. Still at a mere 200 pages, it's amazing how deeply immersed you become in this woman's world. The carefully articulated details and the dramatic interiority of the narrator are vivid and evocative. Its shadow will loom for weeks and perhaps even years, such as has now happened with me with The Birds by Vesos. And, it's a sort of reading maxim or even axiomatic that reading builds empathy. This is one of the things we teach school children. And while I don't agree that all great books specifically or even indirectly build empathy, this is definitely one of those books that builds empathy, at least if you shed your predispositions and so on, like I'm saying. I think that Haushofer joins the ranks of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Sylvia Plath, Natalia Ginzburg, and Simone de Beauvoir, as I'll talk about throughout this video. And she offers a wonderful line for bookworms to keep in their arsenal. If I ever get out of here, I shall lovingly and longingly caress every book I find. What we are reading in The Wall is the sort of retrospective diary of a woman who is writing a couple of years into a very strange circumstance, a very peculiar solitude. An inexplicable and suddenly appearing invisible wall has completely isolated her on the alpine countryside. So because she's starting to write this diary on into this situation, we're getting her narrative and thoughts, or we're getting her narrative of the past filtered through her present sentiments. On page 49, which is the penultimate page you'll read in that first sitting of 50 pages, there's a moment where it says, "The great silence descended on me like a bell jar." And this is, of course, immediately what called up the connection with Sylvia Plath of the Bell Jar book fame, which I read in grad school, and it seemed to put me in my own bell jar for quite a while. It's a really searing and tough book, but serious book. And it's interesting, I had to look this up, but it's interesting to note that Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar was published in the same year as The Wall. At one point, she writes that I would rather turn to the 2nd of July, the day I realized my life depended on the number of matches I had left. That thought struck me, as all disagreeable thoughts do, in the early hours of the morning. Until then, I had lived very recklessly in that respect, without considering that every burned out match could cost me a day of my life. And if you joined me for my talk with Debbie Urbanski or watched my video earlier this year on her debut novel, Afterworld, you'll make that connection that yes, in Afterworld, the connection with the matches comes from this book. Beautifully employed and a wonderful, wonderful detail to give us that sense of time running out and the direness of the situation. The thing that gets me is, yes, of course, the human drama, the human turmoil, but I am also very sensitive to animals. I'm a huge animal lover. And there, in this book, Haushofer captures that symbiotic connection between the woman and the animals that are isolated there with her to such a vivid degree that it almost made turning each page this enormous dramatic event for me as the reader. And it was like my heart just ached with every turn of the page because I fear the worst. She's there with a dog, a cat, and a cow predominantly, and others will show up and come into being along the way. But that symbiotic connection, I don't know that I've ever read it captured so well. Maybe the cat knows me better than I know myself and knows what I could be capable of. And here specifically, the cat, as a lot of cats are, is shying away from her and not being as forthcoming, of course, as the dog, who's just so eager to play and to get attention and to empathize. But now it's like she's starting to see that the cat perhaps can suspect a dimension in the human presence of a capability that's frightful. So yeah, this is one of those books that brings to life so vividly its characters, human and animal, to the point where you can't bear to even think about anything bad happening to them. Yet you also can't leave the pages unturned even when you know the worst is to come. And so, as you might suspect at this point, this is a work of literary naturalism. There is the indifference towards human life from the perspective of nature. There's a fatalistic and deterministic feel to the whole thing. The only creature in the forest that can really do right or wrong is me, and I alone can show mercy. Sometimes I wish that burden of decision making didn't lie with me, but I am a human being, and I can only think and act like a human being. Only death will free me from that. Everything takes its time here, meaning in nature. A time that isn't agitated by 1,000 clocks. There's no haste or urgency. I'm the only disturbance in the forest, and I still suffer from that. I'm not a troublemaker worth taking seriously. The nettles beside the byre will go on growing even if I exterminate them 100 times, and they will survive me. They have so much more time than I do. And there's an interplay here where nature is also a sort of stand-in for society. This woman's plight to survive, even in the face of a force that is indifferent to her, in contrast or comparison, linked to a society that isn't necessarily totally indifferent, but is oppressive toward her. In both cases, her exterior and interior existence is oppressed by the greater world around her. And so the book deals with womanhood, motherhood, anxiety, depression, loneliness. She says, I don't think my behavior was due to any weakness or sentimentality. I was simply following an instinct that had been implanted in me and which I could do nothing to fight against if I didn't want to destroy myself. I was a good mother to little children. Once they grew bigger and went to school, I failed them. I don't know how it happened, but the bigger the children grew, the more insecure I felt with them. If I think about my children today, I always see them as 5-year-olds, and it strikes me that they'd left my life even then. That's probably the age at which all children begin to leave their parents' lives. Quite slowly, they turn into strangers. But that all happens so imperceptibly that you barely notice it. There were moments when that terrible possibility dawned on me, but like any other mother, I very quickly suppressed the thought. I had to live, and what mother could live if she recognized this process? Sometimes she gives these searing one-liners. I'd forgotten how terrible it is to be dependent on an unsatisfied body. And of course, this is loaded with all kinds of meanings. The most ostensible and immediate meaning of that is just that she's hungry. I was forced to do nothing and to wait, a state that I had always particularly disliked. I had waited much too often and much too long for people or events which had never turned up, or which had turned up so late that they had ceased to mean anything to me. And so, yes, like I said, she joins the ranks of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, of the Kate Chopins, the Simone de Beauvoirs, the Virginia Woolfs, and on and on and on, in presenting the struggles that are very specific to women, and especially in terms of motherhood and in terms of being the counterpart, typically the subservient counterpart to a man, especially in society at this time. But she also elevates many things into something that's just universal to all humans. For example, on the long walk back, I thought about my former life and found it unsatisfactory in all respects. I had achieved little that I had wanted, and everything I had achieved, I had ceased to want. That's deep, and I think that expresses something that we all constantly grapple with. It goes back to how to be content, how to be happy, how to get past the sort of default human mode of selfishness, but also a really important balance of understanding what's our limitation that we have control over and what is a real obstacle that's being imposed on us from the outside. I was no longer in search of a meaning to make my life more bearable. So this is after she's been through a lot and is having a sort of epiphany of sorts. That kind of desire, meaning the desire to have meaning in your life, struck me as being almost presumptuous. I'd spent most of my life struggling with daily human concerns. Now that I had barely anything left, I could sit in peace on the bench and watch the stars dancing against the black firmament. And that reminded me of the end of The Giving Tree. Since my childhood, I had forgotten how to see things with my own eyes, and I had forgotten that the world had once been young, untouched, and very beautiful and terrible. I couldn't find my way back there, since I was no longer a child and no longer capable of experiencing things as a child. But loneliness led me, in moments free of memory and consciousness, to see the great brilliance of life again. One way to kind of get the trajectory of this female consciousness presented to us in this book is with these sort of way stations that appear at specific points spread out through the book. And it starts with this: I'm still afraid because I know that I can live only if I fail to understand certain things. And then I was no longer in search of a meaning to make my life more bearable. That kind of desire struck me as being almost presumptuous. And then nothing makes me feel more peaceful than the silent falling of the flakes or a summer rain after a storm. I remember when I first was presented with The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman many years ago, early in my reading life. That, I think, was the first time that my attention was truly tuned or attuned to a female whose aspirations didn't align with her society's expectations and led to oppression. What makes that story even more poignant, yes, but even more impactful is that the people around her aren't even really trying to oppress her. They're trying to help her. But there's just such a misunderstanding. But I think I must have been maybe early teens when I first read that story. And that's just a testament to the power of literature, because that was the first time I truly saw that this could be a thing, that people could be in this situation. And yes, here, even though there aren't any other human characters for the most part, for the bulk of the book hinges on the plight of a lone woman in society. And even though this was written in 1963, and I think we're making a lot of progress, this just boiling it down to a woman being alone, let's say, in a cabin off in the wilderness, is still something that in the cultural consciousness is sort of unacceptable or strange. At first, I did sort of wave this off as a vestige of the past. But then Claire Louise Bennett's afterword to this 2022 edition of the book really made me reconsider. She simply says men can live alone in the woods for years on end without anyone thinking too much about it. If you are a woman living alone, on the other hand, there must be something wrong with you. You are unappealing or barren or disturbed or conniving or frigid or selfish or degenerate or bereft or spent or difficult or abandoned or deviant or bonkers. Someone to be wary of in any case, because it's quite unnatural. It's strange, isn't it, to live on your own if you're a woman. And that got me thinking, and I thought to myself, yeah, I guess I would think that myself. That still does seem kind of strange. And another thing about the wall specifically is that Louise Bennett points out as well is that the female character here, the only way she even comes to be secluded is this crazy, inexplicable event of the invisible wall coming down, the bell jar being put around her. She doesn't have a choice. She can't choose. And I think the big shift today is that she could. Women aren't dependent on men and others for survival. And so I got to thinking about, especially with Henry David Thoreau in Walden, it seemed totally natural and is even applauded, very laudable. And this contrast intensified when, after the wall, I read Jericho Huysmans' A Rebord, Against Nature, in my translation, and I'll be talking about that book here in a couple weeks. But the contrast intensified because in that one, a wealthy male character, Des Esseintes, does willingly choose to seclude himself in the countryside. And then after that book, I happen to be reading The Landbreakers, which is a work of historical fiction that goes back towards the end of the 18th century in the frontier, the wilderness of Western North Carolina and Virginia. And we see in that book how at that time women were literally dependent on men to survive. And so one thing that the wall does is it charts out this sort of turning point in society, in the economy, in the workplace, in technological advancement, where suddenly there's a choice. So all this is to say that the book is charting out this turning point. But I think that whereas the infrastructure of our society has advanced to the point where women don't have this existential dependency any longer, and they can choose to go live in this cabin in the woods or whatever they want. And especially today, they could carry out their lives working for a major company remotely, anywhere in the world, just as we all can. The cultural consciousness of the view of that as a course of action or a path one could take hasn't quite caught up with the infrastructural advancement. I guess another way of saying that is that the stereotype that I think Haushofer's book attacks still exists. And just in case a reader is sort of deaf or blind to the subtext, the end of the book makes it all very clear. I find it really interesting that in 1948, Natalia Ginsburg wrote this: "Women have a bad habit. They sometimes fall down a well. They are seized by a horrid sense of melancholia, drown in it, and struggle to come back to the surface. This is the real problem afflicting women. Women are often ashamed of having this problem and pretend not to have any issues whatsoever and to be energetic and free and walk around with steady steps and enormous hats and pretty dresses and painted lips and an assertive and scornful attitude. However, I never got round to meeting a woman who did not, after a little while, reveal something painful and pitiful that simply cannot be found in men. A continuous falling down a deep, dark well, something that is typical of feminine disposition and perhaps originates from an age-long tradition of subjugation and subjection, which is not easy to win over." Now, in contrast, and compare that to what Marlen Haushofer wrote in 1963 in The Wall. "Sometimes, long before the wall existed, I wished I was dead, so that I could finally cast off my burden. I always kept quiet about this heavy load. A man wouldn't have understood, and the women felt exactly the same way as I did. And so we preferred to chat about clothes, friends, and the theater, and laugh, keeping our secret, consuming worry in our eyes. Each of us knew about it, and that's why we never discussed it. That was the price we paid for our ability to love." In her monumental touchstone of feminism, Simone de Beauvoir famously wrote that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Compare that to what Marlen Haushofer wrote in 1963. The womanliness of my 40s had fallen from me, along with my curls, my little double chin, and my rounded hips. At the same time, I lost the awareness of being a woman. My body, more skillful than myself, had adapted itself and limited the burdens of my femininity to a minimum. I could simply forget I was a woman. Even with all this, however, I do want to point out the sort of oblique character of Hugo. It's Hugo's property. She was staying with Hugo and his wife when she got cut off by the wall. But it's Hugo's property and his resources that she lives off of. But there's enough in there to indicate that Hugo seems to be a sort of male counterpart of the female narrator. He is a man who is ill-suited to the role expectations society has for him. And so on the one hand, when I read some of this stuff from Natalia Ginzburg most saliently, I think to myself, a lot of guys go through this stuff too, and depression is a lot more understood now. But I do think that clearly there is something that's peculiar to what women deal with. And while part of me wants to say, I resonate with some of this, and I know guys who deal with depression who resonate with this feeling of falling in the well, but trying to keep positive exteriors and all of this, there is still something that is distinct. And this is what we would do well to open up to and to listen to in books like Haushofer's. For Haushofer, in the end, it is the woman's maternal instinct that is the sort of paradigm shift between the mere depression and then the specific womanly loneliness that Natalia Ginzburg speaks of. And it's this maternal instinct, which is that burden to love. What's interesting about it is that in The Wall, we see that maternal instinct both keeps her alive and slowly kills her from its burden. And I think that right there is the most powerful element of this particular depiction of human struggle. And so on that note, one way that you could look at The Wall is as a breviary of searing truths. And one such of those truths offered here that has inextricably wedged itself into my heart is this one. Loving and looking after another creature is a very troublesome business and much harder than killing and destruction. It takes 20 years to bring up a child and 10 seconds to kill it. Yes, loving is much harder than killing or walking away.